Conventional wisdom holds that after the revolution, the Bolsheviks built a brand new Soviet society. They destroyed the monarchy and pursued witch hunts against the bourgeoisie. All along, they lifted millions of peasants and workers out of the depths of poverty and illiteracy that characterized Tsarist Russia. In this video, I question this myth. I draw attention to the legacies of the Tsarist system of estates, in Russian called Soslovia. The social divides which the Bolsheviks inadvertently helped consolidate help explain why so few Russians are able to or are prepared to challenge the autocracy in present-day Russia.
Tsarist Russia divided social groups into categories of soslovia. This was a feudal relic, but it survived in law until the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. The word soslovia means estate, like the estates of the realm that we are familiar with from reading about the French Revolution. The estate system distinguished between the hereditary nobility, as well as personal nobles who could acquire the title through state service at the very top of the social hierarchy, the clergy, the urban estate consisting of merchants, artisans, and meshania, the urban lesser bourgeoisie, and finally, at the very bottom, the peasant estate. Different estates had different rights, freedoms, and opportunities to better their lot. Tsar Alexander II abolished serfdom in 1861 as part of his progressive reforms to modernize Russia. Still, many peasants remained poor and tied to the land. They received land allotments, but still had to redeem them or repay the government for the compensation it paid to landlords when serfs were set free. Even though there were restrictions on the rights and liberties of the other estates, the hereditary aristocracy, the personal nobles, the clergy, and the merchants and even meshania had greater freedoms than peasants. The more privileged soslovia colonized the private schools, the classical gymnasiums, and the commercial colleges, while only a small proportion of the peasant population could access them. Urban life and education also made educated citizens appreciate the merits of a rule-based democratic society, and the urban merchants and meshania had first-hand experience of owning property and running a business. They were the proto-bourgeoisie that political theorists have suggested would support rule of law and a democratic system. The archaic soslovia divisions became progressively out of sync with the demands of a modernizing society towards the beginning of the 20th century. But the estates continued to matter for who became the new professional class in late Imperial Russia on the eve of the Bolshevik Revolution. Peasants, especially former serfs, found it harder to enter the modern age than the professional middle class, as they had neither the resources nor the human capital to enter schools with high tuition payments and the professions alongside the habitually educated estates. The Bolsheviks abolished the soslovia shortly after they took power and immediately conducted witch hunts and terror campaigns against the so-called class enemies. Tens of thousands of prominent aristocrats, clergymen, and merchants were massacred or forced into hiding or exile. Meanwhile, the new Marxist-Leninist dogma called factory workers the proletariat the social vanguard, while peasants were to be the workers' allies in the struggle against capitalism. But Lenin quickly realized that without the educated layers of Tsarist society, it would be impossible to achieve a communist utopia. The class enemies were forced to work for the Bolsheviks, often at gunpoint, as doctors, engineers, scientists, etc., towards the aim of rapid industrialization and modernization of the country. Eventually, the Bolsheviks discreetly stopped tracing the Tsarist origins of the Soviet professional class. It became known as the new Soviet intelligentsia, or layer, that coexisted alongside the workers who, in ideological dogma, were the rulers of the new social order. Despite the Soviet regime's ideological proclamations about worker-peasant empowerment, the formerly underprivileged social strata faced severe restrictions to social mobility. In the late 1920s, Stalin embarked on a brutal campaign of collectivization, or forcing peasants to give up their livestock and join collective farms. Faced with peasant resistance to collectivization, Soviet authorities adapted draconian laws to trap peasants who had not managed to escape in the collective farms, or kolkhozye as they became known. Peasants could not easily leave the village without permission from the local Soviet or council and collective farm managers. They were also deprived of the rights and opportunities that urban citizens enjoyed in the Soviet Union, such as obtaining education from prestigious universities and joining the elite professions that allowed travel abroad and access to foreign periodicals, newspapers, and other sources of information alternative to Soviet propaganda. These restrictions lasted well into the 1950s and 60s. They were akin to the serfdom of the bygone days. But even toward the zenith of the Soviet colonial dictatorship, the new peasant entrants into towns experienced severe prejudice from established urbanites. Many joined the factory workforce or studied in regional nursing or teacher training colleges that were not as prestigious as the metropolitan universities. It is true that scores of factory workers and peasants enjoyed social uplift via the managerial and party cadre route to social mobility. The Soviet leaders Nikita Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev, and Mikhail Gorbachev of peasant worker stock personified these opportunities. And many educated professionals from clergy, merchant, meshania, and even nobility backgrounds embraced communism as a socially progressive answer to the evils of the monarchical order and capitalism. The Bolsheviks were in fact overwhelmingly drawn from this stratum. But many descendants of the pre-revolutionary educated society eschewed the party cadre route to social advancement because of their hostility to communist ideology. To avoid pursuing jobs saturated with Marxist-Leninist dogma, they studied STEM subjects and embraced professions where they would not be expected to make daily affirmations of their faith in Marxism-Leninism or join the party. They chose professions that would enable them to keep their autonomy. The prominent Soviet-era dissident Andrei Sakharov comes from this milieu, as does the slain post-Soviet period opposition politician Boris Nemtsov. The relative autonomy of jobs in the sciences allowed for greater freedom to critically discuss Soviet politics and raise taboo subjects like Stalinist repressions or violations of basic human rights. A privileged few among the intelligentsia were able to travel abroad, where they attended scientific conferences and were exposed to information about life in democratic countries. Sociologists who have studied Soviet class have found that parents passed on aspirations of privilege and education to their children. The grandchildren of Tsarist-era professionals of noble, clergy, or bourgeois pedigree were likely to retain their professional status, while peasants were playing catch-up against the established professional class. With the demise of the Soviet system, new social fault lines emerged. Some well-placed individuals became phenomenally rich, while others fared poorly in the context of transition to market capitalism in the 1990s. But those who held excellent education credentials and professional occupations did better than the workers and farmers, many of whom lost their jobs and livelihoods. Vladimir Putin came to power, vowing to restore prosperity and stability for ordinary Russians. As the public sector expanded under Putin, state employment offered many citizens the kinds of safety nets that they had lost with the demise of communism. For the rural youth and the urban working classes, becoming an employee of the police forces or other agencies associated with the security apparatus became a ticket out of poverty. Becoming a school teacher or an office clerk working for the state meant increased pressure to conform to the party or regime line, just as it had under communism. These social groups form the bulk of the so-called autocratic middle class. though many members of the Russian intelligentsia have also openly expressed support for Putin, or have at least declined to challenge Russia's autocratic regime and the war against Ukraine. These social divides continue to matter as we try to make sense of Russians' social support for the war against Ukraine and challenges to it. For instance, although some school teachers have refused to indoctrinate children with the vile Kremlin narratives about the so-called fascism in Ukraine that Russia is fighting, many have willingly obliged.
Хабаровская молодежь и учителя сегодня устроили флешмоб в поддержку российской миротворческой операции на Донбассе и Украине.
It is also not coincidental that the bulk of the conscripts fighting against Ukraine come from some of the most economically deprived regions and communities. Many are lured into the forces by promises of cash handouts that would appear to be trivial to the more affluent members of the privileged professional groups. But the story goes beyond the immediate well-being of citizens. The bulk of Russian society has been historically deprived of exposure to the kinds of rights and opportunities that nurture information literacy, a civic spirit, and an appreciation for a democratic system of government. Only a small minority of Russian citizens and their ancestors had such exposure, and these values have been passed on from one generation to the next, among families that had been privileged already before the revolution.
Why do some citizens of autocratic states rebel and others conform? And why are so few Russians apparently willing to challenge the autocracy? Russian state propaganda is a powerful tool of the manipulation of public opinion, of course. But why do some citizens better adjudicate between the different news sources and are better able to distinguish between more authentic information and the so-called fake news and propaganda on state-controlled television than others? This video has discussed the history of Russian social divides. And these legacies continue to matter when we try to make sense in a political way of the divisions that continue to mar the democratic movement in Russia, and the divisions that continue to hamper attempts to generate and engender a more active citizen response and challenge to the autocratic regime in Russia.